The glass slipped from his hand before he even realized he had let go. It shattered against the hardwood floor of the dive bar in Virginia Beach, sending amber liquid and ice cubes scattering across the worn planks. But Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison barely noticed. His eyes were locked on the woman sitting 3 stools down, the one who had just answered his buddy's casual question with 2 words that had stopped his heart mid-beat. Viper 1. Those 2 words carried weight that most civilians could never comprehend. A designation that existed only in whispered conversations within the most classified corners of the special operations community. He had heard the rumors over the past 18 months, the kind of stories that got dismissed as beer talk and barracks legend, about a female pilot who had done the impossible, who had earned a call sign that made grown men in the team speak with a mixture of reverence and disbelief. But she was supposed to be a ghost, a myth, someone who operated so far beyond the veil that confirming her existence felt like admitting you believed in shadows. Yet here she sat, in faded jeans and a simple black tank top, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, looking like she could be a graduate student or a yoga instructor rather than the woman who had reportedly flown missions so dangerous that the after-action reports remained sealed even to most flag officers. The question that burned in Jake's mind, the one that kept him frozen in place while his teammates stared at him with confusion and concern, was simple but profound. What kind of crucible does it take to forge a warrior who makes even Navy SEALs drop their drinks in stunned recognition? And what does it cost a woman to become a legend in a world that still questions whether she belongs there at all? Major Rachel Santos had not set out to become anyone's legend. 20 years earlier, she had been a skinny kid from El Paso, Texas, the daughter of a single mother who worked double shifts at a hospital to keep their small apartment and put food on the table. Rachel learned early that the world did not hand out favors, and that survival required a particular kind of toughness that had nothing to do with physical strength and everything to do with refusing to quit when quitting would have been easier. Her mother had that quality in abundance, and Rachel absorbed it the way plants absorb sunlight, making it part of her fundamental nature. When Rachel told her mother at 17 that she wanted to join the military and become a pilot, Maria Santos had simply nodded and said that wanting something and earning something were separated by an ocean of work, and that Rachel should be prepared to swim. Those words became the foundation of everything that followed. The path to the cockpit had been longer and harder than Rachel imagined in her teenage optimism. She earned an ROTC scholarship to Texas A&M, where she studied aerospace engineering while waking up at 4:30 every morning for physical training. Her male classmates in the program often treated her like a novelty at best and an unwelcome intrusion at worst, but Rachel had learned from her mother that other people's opinions were just noise, irrelevant unless you gave them power by listening. She graduated 3rd in her class and earned her commission as a 2nd lieutenant in the Air Force, then proceeded to flight school where the real testing began. The instructors were professional but skeptical, and Rachel understood without being told that she would have to be twice as good to be considered half as capable. She accepted this unfair arithmetic without complaint, because complaining changed nothing and excellence changed everything. Rachel discovered that she had a natural gift for flying, an intuitive understanding of aircraft dynamics and spatial reasoning that her instructors noted in her evaluations with phrases like exceptional situational awareness and superior tactical thinking. But talent alone would not have been enough. The training was designed to break people, to identify those who would crack under the pressure of life-and-death decisions made in fractions of seconds, while pulling G-forces that made your vision narrow and your body feel like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Rachel thrived in that environment not because it was easy, but because she had spent her entire life preparing for it without knowing that was what she was doing. Every time her mother had worked through exhaustion, every time Rachel had studied while her friends partied, every time she had chosen the harder right over the easier wrong, she had been building the foundation for this moment. She earned her wings and was assigned to fly cargo aircraft, solid work, but not what she wanted. Rachel wanted to fly combat missions, to be where the actual fighting happened, but the regulations at the time limited women's roles in direct combat positions. She flew her cargo missions with the same intensity and precision she brought to everything else, earning a reputation as someone who could be trusted with the difficult assignments. The flights into contested airspace where ground fire was a genuine possibility and landing zones were measured in feet rather than comfortable margins. Her commanders noticed, and when the regulations finally began to change, when the doors to combat roles started to open for women who could prove themselves worthy, Rachel was ready. The transition to combat aviation meant another round of proving herself, another cycle of being the first or the only woman in rooms full of men who had their own opinions about whether she belonged. Rachel had developed a strategy for this by now, a simple approach that bypassed argument and went straight to demonstration. She let her performance speak with a voice louder than any words could carry. She volunteered for the toughest training courses, the ones with the highest washout rates, and she completed them in the top percentile. She studied tactics and aircraft systems with an obsessive attention to detail that other pilots found excessive until they flew missions with her and realized that her encyclopedic knowledge of contingencies and backup plans made her the person you wanted on your wing when everything went sideways. Rachel earned a slot flying helicopters in close air support, working directly with ground forces in Afghanistan. This was flying stripped of all pretense and romance, the kind of work where your decisions directly determined whether the troops below you lived or died, where hesitation could be fatal and aggression had to be balanced with precision. She flew nighttime missions using night vision goggles that turned the world into shades of green, navigating through mountain valleys where the terrain left no margin for error and enemy fighters could be anywhere in the darkness below. The ground commanders she supported began requesting her by name, a rare honor that spoke to the trust she had earned through missions flown under conditions that tested the limits of both machine and pilot. It was during her second deployment that Rachel first worked with Special Operations Forces, the quiet professionals who operated in the deepest shadows of the war. She was tasked with providing overwatch for a SEAL team conducting a high-value target raid in a remote valley where intelligence suggested a Taliban commander was meeting with foreign fighters. The mission brief had been sparse on details but heavy on implied danger, and Rachel had studied the terrain maps until she could see the valley in her mind without looking at the paper. The insertion went smoothly, but the extraction turned into chaos when the SEALs encountered a larger force than intelligence had predicted and found themselves pinned down in a compound with enemies closing in from 3 directions. Rachel had been circling at altitude, monitoring radio traffic and scanning the ground with her targeting systems, when the call came through with controlled urgency that barely masked the desperation of the situation. Troops in contact, danger close, need immediate fire support. The rules of engagement in these situations were clear but complicated, requiring positive identification of targets and assurance that friendly forces were clear of the strike zone, all while the seconds ticked away and men were fighting for their lives below. Rachel brought her helicopter down in a gun run that took her through a corridor between mountain peaks so narrow that her co-pilot later admitted he had closed his eyes and prayed. She engaged the enemy positions with precision that bordered on surgical, using her weapons systems to suppress the fighters while talking calmly on the radio to the team leader below, adjusting her fire based on his real-time updates until the SEALs could break contact and reach the extraction point. After the mission, the SEAL team leader, a weathered chief petty officer with 15 years in the teams, had sought her out to shake her hand. He told her that she had saved lives that night, not just through her flying, but through her calm under pressure and her ability to make split-second decisions that were exactly right. That conversation planted a seed in Rachel's mind, the beginning of an idea that would reshape her entire career trajectory in ways she could not yet imagine. The more Rachel worked with Special Operations Forces, the more she understood that there was an entirely different level of military aviation beyond what she had already achieved. A realm where the missions were so sensitive that they existed outside normal chains of command, and the pilots were selected through processes that most aviators never even heard about. She began to hear references to units that had no official names, call signs that appeared in no public records, and aircraft modifications that pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible. Rachel started asking quiet questions of people she trusted, expressing interest not out of idle curiosity, but with the focused intention of someone who had identified her next objective and was beginning to map the path toward it. The opportunities for women in these specialized units were virtually non-existent. Not because of official policy, but because of the practical reality that the pipeline to get there ran through career paths and assignments that few women had yet traversed. Rachel understood that she would need to build a resume so undeniable that it would override any hesitation about being the first to break through this particular barrier. She volunteered for instructor duty, teaching combat aviation tactics to new pilots, which gave her deeper expertise in the theoretical foundations of what she had been practicing. She earned a master's degree in strategic studies through night classes and weekend work, adding intellectual credentials to her operational experience. She took on additional deployments, building a record of combat missions that grew thicker with each rotation. When Rachel finally submitted her application packet for assessment and selection for a classified Special Operations Aviation Unit, she knew it was a long shot. The selection process was notoriously opaque, with acceptance rates in the single digits even for highly qualified candidates. She was not surprised when months went by with no response, assuming her packet had been politely declined without official notification. Then one morning she received orders to report to a nondescript office building at Fort Bragg for what was described only as an evaluation. She arrived to find a panel of senior officers and senior enlisted personnel whose faces betrayed nothing as they spent 6 hours asking her questions that ranged from technical scenarios to ethical dilemmas to hypothetical mission planning problems that had no clear right answers. The assessment phase lasted 3 weeks and was designed to test not just her flying skills, but her psychological resilience, her decision-making under stress, and her ability to function with minimal information in ambiguous situations. Rachel was asked to plan missions with incomplete intelligence, to fly profiles that pushed her and the aircraft to the edge of their capabilities, and to endure interviews that probed every aspect of her background and motivation. She was not told how she was performing or whether she had any realistic chance of being selected, and that uncertainty was itself part of the test, a way of seeing who could continue to perform while standing on unstable ground. When the call came that she had been selected, Rachel felt not triumph but a quiet settling of purpose, a sense that she had arrived at the place she was supposed to be. The training that followed made everything she had done before feel like preparation for the real work. She learned to fly missions so low that she could count individual trees, to navigate using terrain features rather than GPS because GPS could be jammed or spoofed, to operate in conditions of absolute radio silence where the pilot had to make all decisions without support or guidance from command. She learned to work with night vision technology so advanced that it turned darkness into an advantage rather than an obstacle, and to employ weapons with precision measured in feet from aircraft moving at speeds measured in hundreds of knots. The missions Rachel flew once she was operational were the kind that would never be publicly acknowledged. The invisible work that happened while the nation slept, and that made the morning news possible even though the connection would never be drawn. She inserted reconnaissance teams into denied territory where their presence could spark international incidents if discovered, extracted intelligence assets from situations where minutes separated success from catastrophe, and provided overwatch for operations targeting individuals whose names appeared on lists maintained by very few people in very secure facilities. Each mission carried stakes that were both immediate and profound, and Rachel approached every one with the same meticulous preparation and calm execution that had become her hallmark. Her call sign, Viper 1, came not from her own choosing, but from a mission that became instant legend within the small community of people cleared to know about it. A SEAL team had been compromised during a raid in hostile territory, their extraction helicopter shot down by a lucky enemy round that turned unlucky for everyone involved. Rachel had been flying backup that night, and when the primary extraction bird went down, she immediately volunteered to go in alone while the quick reaction force was still spinning up. The landing zone was hot, with enemy fire coming from multiple positions, and the downed crew and the SEAL team were pinned in a position that gave them maybe 10 minutes before they would be overrun. Rachel came in fast and low, using the terrain to mask her approach until she was almost on top of the position, then flared her helicopter into a landing in a space barely large enough to accommodate the aircraft. She kept the rotors turning while taking fire from 3 sides, using her own weapons to suppress the closest threats while the SEALs, and the downed crew loaded casualties and fought their way to the bird. Her co-pilot that night later said he aged 10 years in the 5 minutes they were on the ground. Watching tracers arc through the darkness while Rachel calmly managed the aircraft and called out targets with the detachment of someone reading a grocery list. When she finally pulled pitch and got them out of there, with every soul accounted for and the helicopter taking damage but still flying, one of the SEALs had keyed the radio and said, "Viper 1, you are one cold-blooded snake, and I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give." The call sign stuck because it captured something essential about Rachel's approach to the work. She was not reckless or unnecessarily aggressive, but when the situation required it, she could strike with a speed and precision that felt almost reptilian in its efficiency. And she could do it while maintaining a calm that made everyone around her steadier. The SEAL community, which was sparing with its respect and careful about who it admitted to its inner circles of trust, adopted her as one of their own. They knew that when Viper 1 was on the schedule, the mission had a level of support that made long odds a little bit shorter and bad situations a little more survivable. Rachel flew more than 200 combat missions over the next 4 years, building a classified service record that would never appear in any public accounting of her career, but that earned her decorations that she could not wear in public and recommendations from commanders who worked in offices with no names on the doors. She was promoted to major and given increasing responsibility within her unit, training new pilots and helping to develop tactics for missions that had never been attempted before. She worked herself to exhaustion repeatedly, driven by a sense that the work mattered in ways that transcended any individual mission or personal achievement, that she was part of something larger than herself that was worth the cost it exacted. But the cost was real and it was cumulative, paid in sleepless nights and relationships that never got the time and attention they needed to survive, in the hypervigilance that made civilian life feel strange, and the memories of missions that had ended badly despite everyone's best efforts. Rachel carried the weight of decisions made in fractions of seconds that had resulted in people living or dying, and while she had made the right call more often than not, the times when the outcome had been less than perfect haunted her in quiet moments. She learned that being good at the work did not make you immune to its costs, that courage and skill could not prevent you from feeling the human weight of what you were asked to do. Rachel also navigated the complex reality of being a woman in a world that had only recently and grudgingly made space for her. She dealt with the colleagues who could not see past her gender, the ones who attributed her success to affirmative action or political correctness rather than the undeniable evidence of her performance. She handled the extra scrutiny that came with being a pioneer, knowing that her failures would be interpreted as evidence of why women should not be in these roles, while her successes would be dismissed as exceptions. She maintained her composure through comments and situations that would have justified anger, choosing instead to let her work speak and to save her energy for the mission rather than wasting it on battles that would change no minds. There were also the men who became genuine allies and brothers, who judged her solely on her abilities and who trusted her with their lives because she had earned that trust repeatedly. These relationships, forged in the shared experience of difficult missions and mutual respect, were among the most meaningful of Rachel's life. They were proof that the barriers could be overcome, that excellence could eventually transcend prejudice, and that the work itself could create bonds stronger than the artificial divisions that small-minded people tried to maintain. The SEAL teams she worked with most closely became her extended family, men who would have walked through fire for her as she had repeatedly put herself in danger for them. After 6 years in the Special Operations Aviation Unit, Rachel was offered a staff position at the Pentagon, a promotion that would advance her career and give her influence over policy and resource allocation. It was the kind of opportunity that most officers would accept without hesitation, a chance to shape the larger direction of the force and to operate at a strategic level. Rachel considered it seriously, understanding the value of having people with operational experience in positions where decisions were made, but ultimately she declined. She was not ready to leave the cockpit, not ready to trade the direct impact of flying missions for the indirect influence of staff work. She knew her time at the controls was finite, that there would come a day when she would move on to other responsibilities, but that day had not yet arrived. She took a different assignment instead. moving to a training role where she could pass on what she had learned to the next generation of pilots while still flying regularly enough to maintain her edge. It was in this capacity that she found a new sense of purpose, discovering that teaching could be as rewarding as doing when you were teaching people who would go on to do work that mattered. Rachel developed a reputation as a demanding instructor who set high standards, but who invested genuinely in her students' success, who could break down complex skills into understandable components, and who could diagnose weaknesses and prescribe solutions with the precision of a surgeon. The night at the bar in Virginia Beach had been an accident of timing and circumstance. Rachel had been in town for a conference, one of the rare occasions when she was not in a flight suit or uniform, but could blend into the civilian world in regular clothes. She had stopped in for a drink, planning to have one beer and then head back to her hotel, when a group of young guys at the bar had started chatting with her in the way that young guys in military towns chat with women in bars. They were harmless and friendly, and Rachel had answered their questions politely without giving away much about herself. Then one of them, clearly trying to impress her, had mentioned he was a Navy SEAL, and his buddy had asked her if she was military. Rachel had hesitated for a moment, weighing whether to deflect or answer honestly, and had decided on honesty. When they asked what she did, she gave them the generic answer about being an Air Force pilot. When they pressed for details, asking what she flew, she had been deliberately vague. Then one of the older guys in their group, a lieutenant commander who had been quiet up until then, had asked her call sign in a tone that suggested he knew exactly what he was asking and what the answer might reveal. Rachel had looked at him for a long moment, recognizing in his eyes someone who had been in the same dark places she had been, and she had answered simply and truthfully. Viper 1. The effect had been immediate and dramatic. The lieutenant commander had dropped his drink, his face going through a series of expressions that ranged from shock to disbelief to something like awe. His buddies had looked at him in confusion, not understanding what had just happened, but he had understood perfectly. He had heard the stories, knew enough of the classified world to recognize that call sign and what it represented, and he was staring at her with the kind of respect that Rachel rarely received to her face. After a long moment of frozen silence, he had recovered enough to extend his hand and introduce himself properly, speaking to her now not as a woman at a bar, but as a fellow warrior whose reputation had preceded her. What followed had been one of the most genuine conversations Rachel had experienced in years. The SEALs, once they understood who she was, had treated her like the brother they never knew they had, swapping stories and talking shop with the easy familiarity of people who shared a common language and common experiences. They asked her questions about missions she could not discuss in detail, but could acknowledge in general terms, and she asked them about their work with the same professional curiosity. The barriers of gender and service branch dissolved in the face of mutual respect and shared understanding of what it meant to do the work they did. Rachel left the bar that night feeling something she had not felt in a long time. A sense of being fully seen and recognized for who she actually was rather than being filtered through other people's expectations or preconceptions. The encounter reminded her why she had chosen this path and stayed on it despite all the obstacles and costs. It was not about proving anything to anyone or breaking barriers for symbolic reasons. It was about doing work that mattered with people who understood its significance, about being part of a community that valued capability and courage above all else, and about knowing that when it counted most, when lives hung in the balance, she could be counted on to deliver. That knowledge, that sense of purpose and competence, was worth everything it had cost to achieve.